I'm honored tonight to introduce our speaker, Jim Tolstrup. Uh, I first heard Jim talk about gardening on the wild side in an Audubon Rockies webinar 3 years ago when I was thinking about going native with plants in my yard. And inspired by that, I set about getting rid of turf and planting bird-friendly native plants in my Denver front yard and I'm hoping in my backyard. And I ended up buying about 90% of the plants that I planted from the place that Jim founded 20 years ago, High Plains Environmental Center in Loveland, which is located in the heart of the Centera planned community. You may have seen or noticed it. It's between I-25 and Boyd Lake State Park. What you may not know is that it's essentially a greenhouse, a test bed, a demonstration garden, and also a pretty good place to bird with a couple of reservoirs near there. At any rate, I really got into that, and it's all thanks to Jim. Jim is author of a book whose first word is one of my favorite coined words that I've run across lately, Suburbitat, a guide to restoring nature where we live, work, and play. It's a book about the center's efforts to bring native landscapes into everyday neighborhoods. Jim previously served as land steward at the Shambhala Mountain Center in Red Feather Lakes, Colorado, up a little farther north than where he is. He also ran his own landscape design business in Kennebunkport, Maine. You may have heard that place. You may not know. He installed gardens at the Summer White House for George and Barbara Bush back in the day. Jim holds a certificate in gardening arts from the Landscape Institute of Harvard University and the Arnold Arboretum. He's received numerous awards for landscape design, from Plant Select all the way to Denver Water. He teaches widely throughout our state and has written numerous articles on gardening and environmental stewardship. Without further ado, Jim Tolstrup.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Unfortunately, so the Google robots gave me this slide, and if I was able to use my PowerPoint slides, I thought this was kind of cool because it has these flowers opening up, and these are probably apple blossoms. They're not a native plant, but they do show one thing that we're going to talk about in this presentation, and that is like the flower morphology that has a tremendous amount to do with what specific benefits that they provide to wildlife. And the Rosaceae family that includes apples is known for having 5 petals and many, many stamens. And because the flowers are so open and have so many stamens, they are accessible to a lot of different kinds of insects. And so they're thought of as being kind of generalist for pollinators. So next slide, please. So this is the garden at High Plains Environmental Center. And as Patrick mentioned, we are located in the Centera development, which is a master planned community. It spans about 3,000 acres that is almost evenly divided by I-25 in Loveland. So Highway 34 is the southern border, and I-25 goes through the middle. And this is an area that has been described as a bullseye for business in northern Colorado. So in no sense is it a pristine wilderness. And the thing that I find so compelling about High Plains Environmental Center and our relationship with the developer and with the whole community is that we are restoring nature where we live, work, and play. It is not a pristine wilderness that we drew a circle around it and just said, don't build here. And it really it answers a question that can wildlife share the communities that we occupy? And perhaps be in very recent times, we never really asked that question. It wasn't really a concern, but human beings are taking up so much space that we really have to think about preserving native biodiversity in the communities that we design and build. So the office building that you see in the background is one of the part of the corporate campus that's on the other side of the lake from us. And the developer, McWhinney, their headquarters in northern Colorado is there. And the story of how this evolved in the first place is that when the developer brought the plans to to the city of Colorado in Loveland, Colorado, in the late 90s, the city planning commission said at build out, this must be 20% open space. So one of the partners working with McWhinney, McStain Neighborhoods, their president, the president of their company was Tom Hoyt, and he suggested create a standalone nonprofit, donate the land to the nonprofit, and create a funding mechanism that collects a fee from development that helps offset the cost of managing the open space. And so that has grown into an endowment of $2.44 million that helps us manage a 275-acre open space in perpetuity. And as Patrick was saying, it's a great place to see birds in a highly developed and heavily populated area. And to me, this is a very hopeful vision for the future. Obviously, there's a lot of development going on up and down the Front Range. And we tend to think like, do we save the environment or do we develop? In a sense that there's one or the other, it's not both. And we are asking the question, what can we save within development? What can we create habitat for within development? And we are learning amazing things about that question. One of the things we had the tremendous latitude in experimenting with is planting plants and not watering them at all. What plants will survive? What native plants can you use in landscaping? And what types of species will those plants support? So the photo that we're seeing here is one of our main garden areas. We call this the promenade garden. You can see with the archway, and there's if we widen the view here, you would see there's hedges on both sides of this. It is very much like the O'Fallon Perennial Walk in Denver Botanic Gardens. And one of the things I see here is my sort of classical training as a landscape designer. I don't think we have to throw out the basic principles of structure in the landscape, even when we're using native plants. And the great thing about this is it changes throughout the season. Different things bloom at different times. You have different foliage colors. This photo happens to be in October. So here we're seeing the beautiful colors of the sumac turning brilliant red, and the late tansy aster here blooming, some rabbit brush behind it. And again, this is a garden that is never, ever watered. It has not been watered once since 2015. And we do have clay soil and a high water table. But again, we are pushing this to the limit. The average person in Colorado uses 90 gallons of water per day to support exotic landscaping. And this beautiful landscape that is full of all kinds of living organisms and all kinds of birds and insects is never watered and hasn't been watered in 9 years. Next slide, please. Next slide. So if you could just go back one. Yeah. So advance it one, please. There we go. So we're drilling in a little bit deeper, looking a little bit closer at these plants. And it is worth mentioning that this particular plant, I'm going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about an entomologist who did a study within our garden and counted bees there. But this particular plant, the tansy aster or Bigelow's tansy aster, Macaranthera bigelovii, is a really interesting plant because this plant has extrafloral nectaries. And so the nectaries are part of the plant that produces nectar. And we typically think of that as being in the flowers. And it's one of the things that attracts insect pollinators to the flowers. These plants have extrafloral nectaries, meaning other places on the plant that are producing nectar. And when I asked our entomologists why the plant would do that, it just makes it more attractive. But in that way, it's providing a lot more than for insects to forage on. And this was one of the plants that was by far the most visited plant by the most number of species in our garden. And a lot of people will look at this plant and think like, well, it's kind of weedy. You plant it and it springs up all over the place. And that's true. But if you can accept that as a characteristic and it fills in all the space with beautiful blue flowers very late in the year, September and October, it is it's a joy to see how many things are attracted to this. Next slide, please. So when we go in even further, you can see there's this sulfur butterfly. There's a lot of flies and wasps and bees and I've seen several different species of Lepidoptera on these plants. And so before I really knew very much about the plant pollinator relationships, I have always just been very interested in looking closely at plants and really seeing what's going on there. And I really noticed this the most when I have taken a lot of photographs of wildflowers and flowers in our garden. And I used to joke about it. There's always these like you're trying to take pictures of these flowers, but there's always these insects in the way that are sort of photobombing our flower shots. And it just made me realize that you look deeper and deeper into this world of flowers, and you see there's really a tremendous amount going on there, and particularly with native plants. And I'm going to talk about why in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So these are just, again, photo bombing. I was taking pictures of wildflowers, and all of these other organisms appeared, and the relationships between the flowers and their pollinators are extremely intricate, and we're really just scratching the surface of understanding which species of insects go with which particular flowers. But this is really just a collage of all the different insects and birds in some cases that I've seen on different flowers here in northern Colorado. Next. So this is Dr. Paul Oppler. He was an entomologist at CSU, and during the years of the COVID pandemic, 2020, 21, 22, Paul Oppler came to the gardens at High Plains Environmental Center and also the Chipungu Sculpture Park in Centera and other places in northern Colorado. And he was capturing bees and counting them and looking at which bees were going to which specific species of wildflowers. And I was mentioning earlier that for years I've been giving talks about native plants, and native plants are critical for our native biodiversity and our native fauna. And I couldn't really say which plants and which insects are going to which flowers. And So Paul did a study in our garden and counted over 100 species of native bees in this garden. And in Colorado, we have 934 species, 935 species of native bees, but a huge number of them could be found in this garden. And when I said to him, that's amazing. Why do you think there are so many here? And he said, because of the diversity and the density of the native plants in your garden. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the mechanism of pollination works, and that'll help us to understand the relationships between the pollinators and the plants. So 60 to 80% of plants require animal pollinators, and the remaining plants rely on wind pollination. And before we leave this, I just want you to look at the legs of this bee, because this might be one of the best shots that I have that really shows like what a mess this whole process is. And it's not like bees are intentionally doing this work of pollination. They are just literally covered with pollen, and they go from flower to flower. And as long as the flower that they're going to is the same species that the flower they just came from, they will fertilize that flower. And I'm going to talk about the flower morphology and how insects and how the flowers are hedging their bets in attracting insects that will go to other flowers of their same kind. But this is a great shot that just shows what a mess the whole process is, and gives a good sense of how the pollination happens. I mean, the insects and birds or whatever just get completely covered with this pollen, and they carry it from plant to plant. Next slide. Plants that are wind pollinated are called anemophilous. And one of the things that is notable about this group is they don't have pretty flowers. You know, I often give this talk or classes about this to kids, and I say, do you like flowers? And the kids say, yeah. And I ask them, what do you like about flowers? And they say, well, they smell nice, they're pretty, they have bright colors. But the reproductive parts on this group of plants is not attractive. They have small petals, they're often brown or dull green, because there's no need to attract anything. They don't have a scent. They don't need to attract, they're not attracting insects. They don't offer nectar to insect pollinators. The pollen is produced in huge quantities because the wind just carries it to other plants. The pollen is very light and smooth, so it can be blown in the wind, and keeps it from clumping together. So that is something that's typical about these. And if you live near pine trees in June, you know exactly what this is like, because they will, in the morning, you'll go out and they will cover your car with greenish yellow pollen. So the strategy for these plants is to create huge amounts of pollen, and just the wind will just carry it in clouds to other plants. Next slide. This shows how flowering plants, basically the reproductive organs of flowering plants are the flowers themselves. And the central part, the stigma, is made up of it's usually sticky on the end. And this flower is a lily, and a lily is a good flower to use because the parts of it are really big and easy to see. But if you touch this stigma on a lily, you'll notice that it's sticky, and that is so that pollen will stick to it. The pollen goes down the pollen tube to the ovary, where the ovules are where the seeds will develop. And the ovary is called either posterior or anterior, based on if it is in front of the calyx of the flower or behind the calyx of the flower. The petals are there to be bright and attractive. They're like a highway sign that is directing the pollinators to to the pollen. And there is the pistil is the altogether, all the things that I just described, is the female part of the flower. And the stamen is the male part of the flower. So that the stamen is made up of the anther, which is the part that is the that carries the pollen, produces the pollen, and it's usually held above the flower by a filament. So stamens and pistils are the male and female parts of the flower. Not all flowers have male and female parts, and the ones that do are either described as being perfect, or they're sometimes called bisexual flowers. So they have both of the parts, both male and female parts in the flower. Next slide, please. So the plants that are pollinated by insects are called Anthophilous, and the ones that are pollinated by vertebrates are called Zoophilous. And these are, again, these plants have large, bright-colored petals to attract insects. They're often sweet-scented. They usually contain nectar. They have moderate quality of pollen. There's less wastage than wind pollination. The pollen is often sticky or spiky, and that's to make it attach to the pollinator. The anthers are firm and inside the flower to brush against the insect, so they're covering it with the pollen. The stigma inside the flower so that the insect brushes against it. And the stigma has a sticky coating so that the pollen sticks to it. So that's how the flowers work with pollination by animal pollinators. Next slide, please. So these are some strategies, and my father taught at the Boston Museum of Science, and I think he would reprimand me for implying that the plants had strategies at all, because what really happens, obviously, in evolution is that what works continues and what doesn't work fails. But there are success equations for success, and a lot of them have to do with the flower morphology, as I've mentioned before. There are plants that have long tubes, and those are plants that either a bee has to climb down that tube, or something like a hummingbird would have to have a long tongue to reach inside that tube. And how the flower benefits is it's not wasting pollen by some pollinator that's going to any kind of pretty flower that it sees here and there. They could be completely unrelated genuses of flowers, and it's wasting a lot of pollen. What has happened as a pattern of success is that the flower shape and a specific pollinator will co-evolve so that pollinator will keep going to the same kinds of plants, and so it will have a higher success rate in pollination. Some plants are buzz pollinated, particularly it's been noted that bumblebees, the vibration of the buzzing of the bumblebees actually causes penstemon flowers to release their pollen. So that is a coevolutionary strategy. And then there's as we looked at in the previous photo, there's a diversity of the ways that bees carry the pollen. And then there's this notion of being oligolectic. And there are some genus and species of insects that will only go to certain genus or species of flowers. And one of them, a notable relationship is the Eriogonum genus and the blue butterflies. Eriogonums are only pollinated by the blue butterflies. And so because they have this oligolectic relationship, they're exclusive of other species, they have a higher success rate. Next slide, please. Here's some other pollinator facts, just throwing in here. As I mentioned, there's 936 species of native bees in Colorado. And I think that is approximately a third of the bee species that are found in North America. And one of the reasons there are so many bee species in Colorado is because we have a wide range of ecosystems, from the flat and dry prairies to the mountain peaks, and a lot of different climates and plant communities in between. 23 of the species in Colorado are bumblebees. 85% are solitary bees. So a lot of people, when they think of bees, they think like the bees in the beehive, but the vast majority of bees are not in a beehive. There are bees like the mason bees, the osmia, and the leafcutter bees. That these are the ones that will visit the bee hotels. If you put those up, they will lay their eggs in tubes and then seal them up either with mud or with leaves that they cut from the plants. And there's also a large number of pollinators that are not bees, including wasps and a large number of flies. Next slide. So the notion of coevolution, virtually every plant species protects its leaves with a species-specific mixture of chemicals. With few exceptions, only insect species that have shared a long evolutionary history with a particular plant lineage have developed the physiological adaptations required to digest the chemicals in their host's leaves. And the one that so many people have heard about in the last few years is the monarch butterfly and its relationship with the Asclepias, or the milkweed family. The Asclepias is pollinated by the monarch, and monarchs lay their eggs on the milkweed plants. Milkweed is poisonous, and very few insects can eat it, but the monarch caterpillar will hatch and eat the leaves with no problem, which actually makes the caterpillar toxic. And other species of caterpillars have mimicked the appearance of the monarch butterfly. And when a bird eats a monarch caterpillar or bites into one, it tastes terrible because it's poisonous and the bird won't eat it. And if the bird sees a similar looking caterpillar, it won't eat that one. And so that's a way that other species have used the protection that the monarch caterpillar has by through mimicry. Milkweed flowers have a peculiar arrangement of called hoods and horns that are arranged in fives. And so the flower all comes together in 5 parts with 5 horns kind of pointing toward 5 hoods. And it's very difficult to access the nectar from that plant. So you don't see a lot of other insects attempting it. Next slide. Insects take the energy that plants generate from the sunlight and send it up the food chain. Insects provide the basis of diet for 96% of all terrestrial birds, particularly during the breeding season. And I've observed this at my own house. I planted a chokecherry. Actually, it's the red leaf chokecherry, the Canada red chokecherry. And I put up a birdhouse that's occupied by chickadees. And when they are breeding, I see the chickadees going out to that chokecherry all day long and flying from the chokecherry back into the box. A well-known author and entomologist, Douglas Tallamy, wrote all about this, the caterpillars that you find on native trees and shrubs. And he had his students, I believe he teaches at Penn State, they would put a net over a tree and then vacuum off the whole tree and count how many caterpillars they found. And there was an astounding number of caterpillars on native species like oaks and only a few species of caterpillars, usually of non-native insects, on things like calorie pears and other introduced ornamental shrubs. And I think that's where Doug Tallamy really began to focus on the critical importance of the native plants for the insects and the critical importance of the native insects for the birds. And we are creating a food desert for birds when we plant exotic species of plants. Next slide. So the decline in biodiversity. Surveys by the Audubon Society revealed that bird populations in Colorado have declined 60% within the last 40 years as a result of suburban sprawl and general loss of habitat. Bees and other pollinating insects have experienced a similar decline within the same time frame. And when we had the big fires in 2020 and in the following year, 2021, many people noticed a distinct drop in the number of birds that we're seeing in the area. And I did note at that time that a lot of birds that are often in the mountains, hummingbirds in particular, filled our gardens in 2020. And we did see a lot of birds, and it really drove home the point that this type of ex situ conservation, so bringing native plants into our gardens and creating habitats where they didn't really exist before, can have a lot of impact on during these stress periods for wildlife, and also creating this connectivity through the urban corridor as our cities and our sprawling suburbs grow and grow and grow and grow. We're losing open space, and if we don't have native plants, then we are not. A butterfly might have to fly 10 or 20 miles to get its next meal, and I can't do that. I can't walk 20 miles before I get a meal, and so we are basically can be creating a impermeable barrier for wildlife. Next slide. And this is just a growing problem all over the United States. I mean, in my lifetime, the population on Earth has doubled from a little over 3 billion to over 7 billion people. And 98% of the lower 48 states has been altered for human use. We have 43,480 square miles of pavement, 62,500 square miles of suburban lawns. I've also heard that as like 40 million acres of lawns. So it is one of our largest crops. It requires more pesticide, fertilizer, and 5% of the carbon that's created by human beings is by lawnmowers and leaf blowers and other small engines. So this is having enormous amount of environmental impact. And these statistics come from, again, from Doug Tallamy, Bringing Nature Home. Next slide. So how can we help pollinators? Next slide. Number one is growing native plants. And again, if we are growing native plants, we are providing forage for our native insects, and therefore we are providing food for birds. But also the plants themselves are worthy of conservation and should be celebrated as something that is really unique to Colorado. They are adapted to our climate. They're adapted to high winds, bright sun, long periods of drought, and for that reason can help us with our growing stresses on our water supply as well. Next slide. Another thing we can do is design landscapes with ecological function. And I took this photo in a nearby open space, but one of the things I liked about it is it explains a little bit about the structure that's necessary. So what we want to do is provide sunny open areas. Most bees forage mainly in the sunshine. Honeybees and bumblebees are possible exceptions. Provide wind breaks on the north and the west when we are subject to high winds here on the Front Range, and that can be extremely difficult for a butterfly or any kind of insect when the wind is really blowing. So to create a little bit of a container for the garden, which is also is good garden design as well, to create that kind of structure and create layers. When I drive around and I look at cottonwood groves in either May or in April or May when shrubs are flowering, or in the fall when different species are showing their different colors of foliage, you notice that in a cottonwood grove, underneath the cottonwood tree, you see layers and layers of plants. You see taller chokecherries and then shorter the golden currants and wood roses and snowberries. And it's like this multi-tiered arrangement. And that kind of structure is particularly beneficial for insects and other wildlife. Of course, dead branches like snags are important for woodpeckers or for raptors for roosting and hunting. And the twigs and leaves on the ground are important for a lot of species. So I will come back to this point about the value of being a messy gardener. Next slide. Avoid pesticides as much as possible, particularly neonicotinoids. So the neonicotinoid pesticides are used by big box nurseries, big stores where their plants are shipped from huge growers and they're shipped all over the country. And the problem with the neonics is they are systemic pesticides. Once applied, they can be toxic for up to 18 months. So a year after you plant your plants, suppose you go to some big, I'm not going to use the name of a company, but you go to a big store and you buy some plants and put them in perennials, and they're flowering the next year. They can still be killing anything that's feeding on them. And of course, what's going to feed on them? Um, Pollinators, birds, a lot of things that we don't really want to poison. And at the High Plains Environmental Center, we use some herbicides for managing large areas of open space. And we're a science-based organization. We are not strictly anti using any type of chemicals, but there are things like the neonics that are, it's just a no-brainer. They should not be on the market. They have far too much collateral damage. I also want to talk about the image in this slide because, again, the Google robots chose this slide. I did not choose the image, but I guess that the robots thought that this picture of honeybees fit the bill, and it does, because neonics are devastating for honeybees because they will go out and collect them and bring them back to their colony. But other people might say to me, well, honeybees are a European insect. They're not native. They carry pathogens that affect our native insects, and they compete with our native insects. And all of this is true. I think that they're critical for producing food. And I think that the statistic is 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat is the direct result of honeybee pollination. So critical for feeding our world population. And I'm not for eradicating honeybees, but we don't allow people who have asked us, can I put honeybees out in your open space? We don't encourage that because we're trying to encourage the other 936 species as well. And I heard somebody saying on Saturday at the Landscaping with Colorado Native Plant Conference that wild bees don't really get their share of the credit for the amount of pollination that they do. But anyway, that's my thoughts about this slide. Next slide, please. Here is, we've heard so much about bee hotels, and this is one that some CSU interns made at the High Plains Environmental Center. And curiously, bees avoided this like the plague for the first year or two. They did not go anywhere near this. And last year, this was swarming with leafcutter bees, which was amazing. There are some important things if you put out bee hotels, and these, again, this is specifically going to be attractive to the leafcutter bees. It's very important that this be maintained in a sanitary way, because the bees can get pathogens and trying to think of the word other insects, diseases, things that can get contaminated to them. Parasites, that's the word. Parasites and pathogens can be communicated to the bees by using these tubes over and over again. So it's good after you get a lot of bees like this in nesting or laying eggs in these, that we need to replace them periodically. They should be clean and dry and kept dry, and it's good if they're south facing and out of strong winds. There's other recommendations for how to maintain these. This year we will change this out and put another one in its place. Next slide. Create intense concentration in areas of flowers. The larger, the better. And this is it's probably a quarter to half-acre garden that's full of native plants near P.F. Chang on the southern part of the Chipungu Sculpture Park. And this is like a billboard on the highway for pollinators. And it is incredible how many species of bees and butterflies I see here all the time. If I wanted to take you any place to prove the theory, this garden is a great place to visit and see how much is actually going on in all these plants, and how attractive they are to bumblebees and other native insects. Next slide. Provide areas of bare ground for nesting. And gardeners often talk about mulches, like should you use wood mulch, or what kind of mulch? Should you use rock, or what's the best kind of mulch? But it's very, very important for many species of bees to have bare ground, because the bees will nest in the ground, and they need to have bare open space. And then also I mentioned earlier about the osmia, the mason bees. They look for mud, and so you need to have areas of open ground. Next slide. So be a lazy gardener, and there are many reasons for cutting plants back in the fall. But first of all, just take a minute and look at the picture. If you look at, and people say like, well, you know, the gardens in winter, we have a long winter in Colorado. We have a long dormant period. And if you look at lawns up and down the Front Range, and lawns just seem to be the go-to for landscaping, they're very boring. They're flat, they're brown, there's nothing going on there. I'd like to look at this and see the different colors and textures in the dried foliage. The different shapes remind me of the flowers in summer, particularly when they have little snow caps on them. I think it's interesting, but it also does a lot to prevent the desiccation of the plants in wintertime. this little bit of foliage will capture the snow and it'll keep the plants from freezing and thawing. We have more freeze-thaw cycles in the Front Range than almost any other part of North America. And it helps to keep the plants alive. It helps hold in the moisture, and it provides cover for overwintering wildlife. If you cut open some of these plants and you look in the hollow tubes of some of these flowers, you'll see that there's overwintering insects there. And those, if you cut that down and you throw it away, you're actually throwing the pollinators that we've worked so hard to create a habitat for, we would be taking them to the dump. And a lot of people have asked me, how late do you have to wait to not be damaging overwintering pollinators? And it's actually quite late, into May. And so one of the ways that I have worked with this in my own home is to have some parts of the garden that are like the wild parts of the garden that I don't cut back, and I never pick up the leaves ever. And so I have earthworms and all kinds of things in those layers of that are being created by the leaves. And in the front of my house that faces the street, I have a little bit more of a earlier tidying regime, but to leave places for insects to overwinter. And I'm sure as birders, you have all observed that birds will pick at these in the wintertime. And this can mean survival for a bird to just pick out a few seeds that are left in these flower heads. So there are so many good reasons to leave the garden as is and be a lazy gardener. Next slide. And lights out. This is critical. Again, as birders, I know that you're aware of the fact that our city lights and our porch lights and street lights are really raise havoc on migrating birds, and they are terribly destructive for insects. And one of the ways that we might work with this is to have a kind of light that is on a motion detector. So if someone comes up to your front door, the light goes on, but it's not on all night long, just trapping moths and disorienting insects and birds. This is a critical issue that I think we really don't talk enough about. Next slide. Avoid pruning to death. Birds need safe places for nesting. And there's if you look on the right side of the screen, this is a red twig dogwood. On the left side of the screen is what the red twig dogwood looks like in the wild. And this is a plant that is planted on the west side of a stone wall. And typically it's a riparian shrub. It grows in the shade. It grows where it's wet. The one that is pruned so heavily here is covered with mites, and it's a very sad plant. And so the moral of the story is plant the right plant in the right place, and don't shear it into a square or into a green meatball, but just let plants have their natural form. And if we don't have a shrub layer that's 8 to 12 feet tall or 8 to 20 feet tall, places that birds can nest, we are really impairing their ability to reproduce in our landscapes. Next slide. Wildlife will visit your garden on a daily basis, and you've probably observed this. I see this all summer long in my garden in Fort Collins, that we have hummingbirds that come by and feed on salvias and acastices every day. And those plants are constantly producing nectar, and this is called trap lining. Bees do this, and hummingbirds will do it as well. They just they know where the plants are. They come every day and just collect the nectar, and they just go over and over. So when you start growing native plants, your garden will be on the map of pollinators, and they will come back again and again. And over time, they will really build up a relationship with your site. Next slide. I've seen little memes on Facebook that says wasps are nice, we're pollinators too. And look, there's a lot of wasps out there. And these ones, the European paper wasps, I don't think there's much to recommend them. They're recent introductions to Colorado. They are devastating our butterfly populations. And they lay eggs in the butterfly caterpillars. And so they're decimating our native butterflies. So one way to deal with these is not to allow places where they can nest. And if you see them building these little paper nests under the eaves of your house or in your garden shed or whatever, just remove them. At the very least, we should not encourage this species because it is really invasive and causing a lot of problems with our native insects. Next slide. Phenology. So it's interesting that gardeners will tell you from a aesthetic perspective that you don't want to have your garden bloom all in April or all in the middle of the summer or all in the fall. You would like to have something blooming at all times. And I don't only eat on Monday or only eat in the morning or only eat in April. So if we want to have things constantly foraging on our landscapes, we have to have things blooming at different times throughout the entire year. Let's go to the next slide and I'll continue making the point there. I worked with a committee, the same group that I've worked with on the Landscaping with Colorado Native Plants conference, the Denver Botanic Gardens, CSU Extension, Front Range Wild Ones, High Plains Environmental Center, Colorado Native Plant Society, and the Butterfly Pavilion. And we created this 2-sheet handout that helps people to understand what groups of plants should I look at to create a garden that will benefit wildlife throughout the entire year. And you can download this if you go to, and we'll mention this at the end, but you can go to the Colorado Native Plant Society website and click on Gardening with Native Plants, and you can find this and print it out for yourself. And basically, the rest of this, the rest of the presentation follows this handout pretty well. And I'm going to go through this sort of quickly and then make a few points at the end because we're getting close to 8 o'clock. So next slide. So the same group created booklets focused on 5 regions: the prairie, southeast, front range and foothills, mountains above 7,500 feet, and the western slopes and low elevation. These you can also download from the Colorado Native Plant Society on the Gardening with Natives tab. And so our group worked on these booklets on how to design and build a native garden. And we have a landscape plan in each of the booklets, one for each of these regions. Next slide. The early season includes the nodding onion, sulfur buckwheat, the eriogonum that I mentioned earlier, that the blue butterflies are attracted to, wallflower, the prairie smoke, Geum triflorum, firecracker penstemon, Penstemon eatonii, blue mist penstemon, Penstemon virens, pasqueflower, Pulsatilla patens, golden banner, Thermopsis divaricarpa. And I think looking at the time, I would like to just skip to the slide that says middle season. So I have a slide that talks about each one of these species, but I think we can just skip through them. And I would encourage people to get a hold of the handout at the Colorado Native Plant Society. So let's skip forward. You can just keep going till we get to the middle season. Prairie smoke, wallflower, firecracker penstemon, blue mist, and golden banner. Mid-season. So in the mid-season, it's pearl everlasting, the milkweeds, harebell, aspen daisy, blanket flower, bee balm, Rocky Mountain penstemon, and black-eyed Susan. I will make a few comments about some of these. Obviously, the Asclepias, the common milkweed is the one that people most often look at that attracts the monarch butterfly. But we often see more butterflies on the what's called the swamp milkweed or rose milkweed. And the blanket flower, even though that is a mid-season plant, the blanket flower is indeterminate flower. So it actually will start mid-season and bloom until a hard frost. So there's nothing in that flower that tells it to stop blooming. So it'll just keep going until the end of the season. So that makes it a good garden flower. And it's a great bee attracting plant. So let's skip forward to the late season. Yeah, just go back just one. Yeah, there you go. So the late season plants are Rocky Mountain bee plant, sunflowers, spotted gay feather, liatris. It says liatris punctata, but there are other liatris I want to talk about. The tansy aster, as I mentioned, that there's the Macranthera tanacidifolia and Macranthera biglobii. And those are ones that bloom late, then they attract a tremendous amount of bees and many butterflies. Goldenrods in every part of the country, from Colorado to the East Coast, there are goldenrods, and they are one of the plants that somehow farming hasn't completely wiped out. And you can see I've driven by from here to Maine in the late summer in the last couple of years and just seen a tremendous amount of these plants, and they they have benefit for a wide number of species. So let's advance through these a little bit more slowly because there's some things I want to say about about each of these. The Rocky Mountain bee plant is an annual, and if you're getting started in growing a native plant garden, I highly recommend this plant because it is so prolific. It's an annual. It'll grow to 4 feet tall in one season. It attracts butterflies, it attracts hummingbirds, it attracts bees, and and it blooms for a very long period. So it's good in the early stages of establishing a garden to have annuals, that because sometimes perennials take a few years to get established. And this is just a great plant that'll grow on any disturbed ground. And you literally just like throw these seeds down. We're a little bit running out of time to get this started, but I think I always think like before St. Patrick's Day, if you get these seeds down, um, you will get results this year. This combined with sunflowers makes a great, very easy and very prolific pollinator garden. Next slide. Sunflowers are really, in many ways, the king of pollinator plants and wildlife forage plants. And it's funny how many people think these are weeds. People say this to us at the High Plains Environmental Center all the time. Like, why do you let all these weeds grow? Because they're critical, and they're like a supermarket for wildlife. The number of bees, butterflies, and later in the summer, the goldfinches will just come in droves to eat the seeds of this plant. This is a super important plant for wildlife. I mean, how much money have we spent on sunflower seeds to feed birds at our feeders where, these plants produce them for free. And not only that, we see lots and lots of butterflies and bees coming to them before the sunflower seeds ripen. Next slide. this plant I wanted to talk about because Liatris Ligula stylus is the most butterfly attracting plant I have ever seen. It's almost like a joke. I bring people when this is blooming to High Plains Environmental Center, and the butterflies are just like swirling around this. It does require a little bit of water, but not more water than we're used to giving our garden plants. And with adequate moisture, these can grow 40 inches tall. So it's they put on a spectacular show. And like I say, I've never seen a plant like this for attracting butterflies. Next slide. The tansy aster we've talked about, extrafloral nectaries, generalist pollinators, another supermarket for insect forage plant. Next slide. And goldenrods, indispensable really for the late summer garden. Next slide. I wanted to quickly go through these. This is not in the handout that I mentioned on Pollinated Plant Society, but you can see exactly what I was talking about here. This is a wild cottonwood grove with choke cherries in the foreground, but it also has snowberry and golden currants. They're like little colonies with several different species working together. And there's a theory about the cottonwoods that they're actually not competing for water with these shrubs, but the hydraulic action of the cottonwood's extensive root system is actually pulling water that benefits these shrubs. And obviously, birds eat a lot of the fruits of these shrubs, and then they sit up in the cottonwood trees and they drop the seeds in their droppings down into below the cottonwoods. So the cottonwood grove seems to act like a nursery to help these shrubs to grow. Next slide. Rabbit brush is another plant that people is ubiquitous on the Front Range, and a lot of people think of this as a weedy plant, but this is one easy way to get open space. So much of our open space is covered with smooth brome, a non-native grass that is hard to get rid of and doesn't really offer a lot of wildlife benefit. I mean, certainly not for pollinators. And one of the easy ways to improve that for pollinator forage is just to let shrubs grow up above the smooth brome. And this is a shrub that is capable of doing that. It can form extensive clumps. And there are years when we have the American painted lady butterfly migration that begins in California and comes through Colorado. And I've seen times when there are just clouds of painted lady butterflies that seem to follow the bloom cycle of this Ericameria genus. Next slide. Interesting thing about the American plum, there's a theory that bees actually selected this shrub for early flowering in sunny open space. So these other shrubs, the chokecherries, the plums, the currants, the snowberry, grow together in a group, and they grow together underneath the canopy of cottonwood trees. But this plant grows by itself out in sunny open meadows, and it blooms before the leaves come out. So it's not that bees would forage on the earliest blooming of the plums, and for that reason it's adapted to being very early blooming. And the bees need it to be warm and sunny in order to forage. So those are characteristics. The ones that bloomed early, the ones that were blooming out in the warm meadow, were the ones that got pollinated, and that it's kind of changed the bloom cycle of this plant. So when you plant this, I plant it in the sun, and typically I see this just growing by itself. Next slide. The chokecherry is another supermarket plant for wildlife. Obviously, a lot of birds eat the chokecherries. It's the host plant for the western tiger swallowtail and the two-tailed swallowtail that lay their eggs on this plant. And the flowers get a lot of attention when they bloom in April and May, and then they're visited again by a lot of species that are looking for the fruit. Next slide. Golden currant. If I were going to recommend the average suburban homeowner one native shrub to plant, I would recommend this because it has beautiful fall foliage. It has a very attractive yellow flowers in spring. There are some cultivars of this that have a distinctly clove smell that is unmistakable. And it's a host plant for the caterpillar of the zephyr angelwing butterfly, and fruits are eaten by birds and all kinds of mammals. I rarely find ripe fruit on this plant because usually the birds get to it before I do. But it's just and it stays a fairly good size. I mean, it won't really ever get much taller than 6 feet tall. So it's kind of a good scale for home gardens. Next slide. Boulder raspberry. You know, the interesting thing about this is you would never notice this plant unless it's blooming. And then it has this huge white flower. Again, it's in the Rosaceae family. You can see the 5 white petals and the many stamens in the center. This is a great plant for bees. And it does sort of blend it into the background when it's not in bloom. Next slide. Woods rose. When I was a kid, my grandmother had a rose, and when it bloomed, it would knock you out the flavor, the fragrance of it. But you know, the way they have hybridized roses is like they hardly have a smell anymore. And the one plant that has that old-fashioned rose smell is the woods rose. It is very fragrant, and that is an attractor for the pollinators. It doesn't bloom for a really long time, but it is followed by large rose hips that are a very important food source for birds in winter. Next slide. So this is one of my final slides here, and this is my neighbor's garden. There was the Front Range Wild Ones had a native landscape tour in Fort Collins last year. Well, actually in 2022. And I suggested this garden because I've just admired this for years, and to me, this is a prototype of what our landscapes could be in Colorado. Obviously, it's beautiful. It's full of color. There's so many different textures and different heights and things going on here. And when you walk by this, when this is in bloom, it's just like thronging with bees and butterflies, and it's just alive with sound and movement of so many different beings that are inhabiting this garden. And it's extremely low water use, and all this homeowner does is pull the occasional weeds, and in late spring just cuts everything to the ground and just lets it all grow back again and lets it stand. The slide that I showed earlier of the garden in winter was the same place, and I just think I would give this garden any kind of award I could for being really the right kind of landscape for Colorado. Next slide. And so I wanted to talk about a few resources that you could fill in this material. The conips.org. Click on gardening with native plants. You'll find tons of material there. The native plant booklets that we worked on, that 2-page season-long gardening for pollinators can be downloaded there for free. The Xerces Society is really focused on insect conservation. If you click on their resources tab, they'll tell you where you can find plants and what kind of plants you should be planting in your region to benefit and preserve our insect populations. And Audubon.org has a special tab on plants for birds and where you can find those plants. Next slide. This is Stephen, and he's our nursery manager at High Plains Environmental Center. We have a plant sale that we grow over 150 species of native plants for Colorado. We grow some shrubs and grasses and lots of flowering plants. If you look at our online catalog, there's a lot of information about not only the ecosystem where these plants come from, but also the size, the height, the color, and there's also some information about the specific wildlife species that they benefit. Our plants can be found at this website, suburbatat.org, and we begin to take our first plant sale orders on April 1st. Next slide. So if you enjoyed this talk and you would like to learn more about the High Plains Environmental Center and the history of our region, how it's changed, how we've impacted it through farming, through development, and what we might do to restore some of our native biodiversity, I wrote this book called Suburbitat. It can be found at this, if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to Amazon.com where you can download an ebook. You don't have to read it on a Kindle. You could read it on your phone. You could read it on your laptop or a PC or any type of electronic device. And I will have a printed book coming out, I think in April. So if you're one of those people that needs to hold a book in your hand and you're interested in this, you'll be able to get it in just about a month or two. So thank you. That's my presentation, and let's see if there's some comments or questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for a very inspiring presentation of the joys of native plants and what they can do for our wildlife. Very interesting that a basis of diets of 96% of the birds, 96% based on insects, particularly during the breeding season.
Exactly, yeah.
Showing just what value native plants can have for a variety of wildlife, and how much we can save, water we can save by without sacrificing beauty and the lushness of the native plants that they provide. So it's really, really great. Let me see what we have in the way of questions. Somebody asked about where they could get a list of the plants, and you've answered that question by saying Colorado Native Plant Society has a handout that's available on their website that goes into detail as to what plants do what and at what season. Yeah.
Yes, the plants that we looked at the end of this presentation, you can download a 2-page handout that gives all that information in detail. They also have lists of nurseries where you can find plants and the native plant booklets so you can find at CONIPS as well.
Okay. Another question: how native, in quotes, is acceptable for bird and insect purposes? I'd like to use Oregon grape holly in a tricky dry shade spot in my yard. It's not native to Colorado, but is native to other parts of the West.
That is such an interesting question. A related question is people ask about cultivars. So sometimes growers will take like Gaillardia and they'll they'll breed one gaillardia that's more red or a different color, and then the question is, are we diminishing its wildlife benefits? It's an interesting question about the Oregon grape holly, because there is some debate among botanists as to whether the Oregon grape holly and the Mahonia repens that's found here in Colorado is not actually the same species. Some people say it is not the same species, and some people say that it is. But I, to answer both of those questions, I think cultivars of native plants, though perhaps not as beneficial for wildlife as the wild native species, are better than exotic plants from Europe or Asia. So if they're cultivars of native plants, I still think they're better than exotic species. And I have a preference for North American natives, even if they're not specifically native to Colorado. And at the High Plains Environmental Center, we list our plants as being prairie and Rocky Mountain plants. Because obviously, if you say Colorado native plants, that is a wide range of ecosystems. I mean, when you get up to the high elevations above Estes Park, or the higher elevations in Colorado, you are much more like 1,000 miles north in Canada than you are in common with what's on the Front Range. So Colorado native is a little bit of an arbitrary political designation, but I do think it's beneficial to look for does the plant grow in ecosystem similar to the ecosystem you live in? But I think that the Oregon grape holly is not really too far out of range to be beneficial in our gardens.
Okay, another question. One of the viewers is asking, do insects set off motion sensors?
That's an interesting point. I've never seen it that they have. I think that they're too small and too light to set them off.
Okay.
But I don't have the tech, the data to really support that. I've just never seen it happen.
Okay. Another comment. I live in Louisville. My front yard was a mixture of rocks and alkaline soil in 2004. I replaced the upper, around 12 inches, that is, with a mixture of organic matter and soil from Harlequin's Gardens in Boulder. This nursery only deals in native plants. Golden currant is the best, but I have to water my bushes and perennials and trees regularly. Why is that?
Louisville. So I'm curious about the soil type. When people talk about how to amend soil or how they water their plants and so on, it's like so much is dependent on what your soil type is. Because usually with clay soils, you don't have to water very often. Clay soils are actually quite good at holding water. I guess I don't have enough information to give a good answer to that. I mean, I almost feel like I would have to walk onto the site and see what's going on.
Okay.
But often people, I will say this, I've seen far more native plants die from being watered than from not being watered. And I've seen landscapers like slaughter large numbers of native shrubs by just attaching them to a drip system and cranking it on and drowning them. So I would err on the side of on the dry side. Even if plants defoliate, we have some things like the golden currant in our garden that will defoliate in September, but they don't die. They come back the next year perfectly fine, and they just get to the end of the growing cycle, and they're just like, yeah, we're done. There's no point in holding our leaves any longer. But they don't really suffer from the drought.
Okay. And another question, how much should I amend my sandy yard in Colorado Springs?
I saw a fascinating presentation from Denver Botanic Gardens at this Landscaping with Colorado Native Plants conference. And so many of us have said for years that native plants don't need compost, and compost is not, compost is for exotic plants, and our natives don't need anything that isn't in our native soil, and so on. But they actually, and I will qualify this by saying they started with a very clay soil at Chatfield, the Denver Botanic Gardens Chatfield. They tried a bunch of different soil amendments, like compost only, gravel only, gravel and compost, wood chips, different expanded shale. They tried different kinds of amendments, and they found that across the boards, the most success they had was a combination of squeegee, which is very, very fine gravel, and compost. And that was in clay soil. I would say in sandy soil, you don't need to increase the permeability of it, but you might benefit from adding more organic material because the organic material is what holds onto the water. So I think that we're beginning to shift our thinking on amending soil for native plants. And that even though like high amounts of nitrogen are not necessary for native plants, increasing the soil permeability as well as its water holding capacity is increased by using some compost.
Okay. And then another question is interesting. Wants you to explain the major categories of bees. What distinguishes the bumblebees from honeybees, other than honey, of course?
Gosh, I think I'm a little out of my league with that. I wish Paul Hoppler could answer that question. I think he could
Yeah.
could tell you. I mean, I do know leafcutter bees by their behavior, that they're solitary bees that will lay eggs in a tube and stuff leaves in the tube. I know that bumblebees, of course, we know from when we were kids, they're fuzzy,
Yeah.
and they nest in the ground. But I don't really know entomology well enough to answer that question.
Sounds like that could be the internet could answer that question.
Yeah, Whitney Cranshaw at CSU could cite chapter and verse on that one, but I could not.
Okay. Let me see what else we've got here. You've mentioned, it says here, the resources that you've mentioned, along with the other native plant sources that you mentioned, such as the Native Plant Society, can be found in the Wild Ones. Are you familiar with that organization?
Yes. Yep.
Wild Ones Front Range Chapter website.
Yeah,
Native Plant
they're a great
Garden
resource
Toolkit.
for all of this, for sure.